Outside, the morning is cold enough to make the ground hard. A thin wind moves through dry grass and bare branches. Somewhere beyond the shelter, beyond the last circle of warmth, the world is still waiting for spring. The animals have grown careful. The stored meat is nearly gone. The baskets are lighter than they were a moon ago, and inside, near the coals, someone stirs a clay vessel with slow, patient movements. There is no feast here, no overflowing bowl, no rich cut of meat, no celebration. Only water, heat, a little ground food saved from better days, and the knowledge of how to make almost nothing become enough. A child watches the steam rise. An elder listens to the sound of the spoon against the pot. A tired hunter warms his hands, not speaking. Hunger has a way of making people quiet, but it also has a way of revealing what a community truly knows. Because survival in ancient North America was not always dramatic. It was not always a great hunt, a heroic journey, or a sudden escape from danger. Sometimes, survival was a bowl of thin food passed from hand to hand. Sometimes, it was a bitter nut made safe by water. Sometimes, it was a handful of dried corn carried on a long path. Sometimes, it was the wisdom to save, stretch, grind, soak, roast, and share. Today, when we say poor people's dishes, we are using a modern phrase for something much older and deeper. Many ancestral communities did not think of food in the same categories we use today. But in every land, in every season, there were humble foods, everyday foods, emergency foods, foods for lean months, that could mean the difference between weakness and strength, between waiting and enduring, between hunger and another sunrise. These are 15 humble dishes and food traditions from ancient North America that may have helped people survive when the world gave them very little. 15. Acorn mush. In some regions of North America, where oak trees grew across hills, valleys, and open woodlands, acorns were more than something that fell unnoticed underfoot. To skilled gatherers, they were a hidden storehouse. But acorns did not give themselves easily. Many were bitter. Some could make the stomach rebel if eaten without care. They had to be cracked, shelled, pounded, washed, and often leached in water until the harshness faded. This was not the work of desperation alone. It was the work of memory. Someone had to know which trees gave better nuts. Someone had to know how long to rinse the meal. Someone had to feel the change in texture, smell the change in the water, and understand when bitterness had become food. Imagine hands at the edge of a stream, cold from the water, moving ground acorn meal through a woven basket. The water clouds and runs brown. The process takes time. Hunger does not make time pass faster. But patience turns a hard, bitter nut into something that can be cooked into mush. Warm, plain, filling. Acorn mush may not have looked impressive. It may have sat in the bowl, thick and earth-colored, without sweetness, without decoration. But in a hungry season, it carried weight. It gave the body something to hold on to. It turned the forest floor into a pantry. And there is dignity in that, because a person who can take bitterness from the land and transform it into nourishment is not poor in knowledge. They are rich in attention.
Okay, gently bring the focus down to
14. Corn gruel. Now the scene changes. The forest opens into fields. Dry corn hangs in storage, tied, stacked, protected from dampness and animals. The best ears may have been saved for planting, ceremony, trade, or future meals. But when food ran low, even a small amount of ground corn could be stretched with water. Corn gruel was one of the simplest ways to make a little go farther. A handful of meal, a pot of water, a slow fire. The mixture could be thin enough to drink or thick enough to spoon. In some places, it may have been softened for children, elders, the sick, or anyone too tired for heavier food. If beans were available, they might be added. If squash remained, it could soften into the pot. If a little fat, dried meat, or wild greens could be spared, the gruel became stronger. But even without those things, it mattered. Listen to the sound of it cooking, a quiet bubbling, a wooden tool scraping the bottom so nothing burns. Steam gathers on the face of the person leaning over the pot. The smell is simple: grain, smoke, warm water. But to someone hungry, it is the smell of relief. Corn was not just a crop. Among many farming communities, it was work, season, planning, and responsibility. Fields had to be cleared and tended. Seeds had to be protected. Harvests had to be dried and stored. A bowl of corn gruel carried all of that labor inside it. It was humble food. But humble did not mean meaningless. It meant that survival could be soft, warm, shared carefully among those who needed it most. 13. Parched corn. There were days when no pot could be carried, days when people moved across long distances, followed trails, traveled for trade, hunting, visiting, or seasonal work. On those days, food had to be light. It had to last. It had to survive rain, heat, and rough handling. Parched corn answered that need. Corn kernels could be dried and roasted until hard, fragrant, and ready for the road. A person could carry them in a pouch. A small amount could be chewed slowly. It did not require a fire at the moment of eating. It did not spill like soup or spoil quickly like fresh food. It was not a grand meal. It was a promise tucked close to the body. Picture someone walking under a wide sky, the land stretching ahead in grass, stone, trees, or snow. Their stomach is not full. Their feet hurt. The next camp is still far away. From a pouch, they take a few kernels of parched corn and place them in their mouth. Dry, hard, smoky, enough to keep moving. That is the quiet power of travel food. It does not comfort like stew. It does not gather people around a pot. But it gives strength in silence. It lets the body continue when stopping could be dangerous. It is food for the space between homes, between seasons, between certainty and risk. And in ancient North America, as in many parts of the world, the difference between survival and failure was often not abundance. It was preparation. 12. Bean stew. When the body is tired, it asks for more than warmth. It asks for strength that stays. In many farming communities across parts of ancient North America, beans were one of the foods that helped answer that need. They were not always dramatic to look at. Small, dry, hard, kept in storage until water and fire changed them. But once they softened in a pot, they became something steady. A bean stew could begin with very little. A clay vessel, water, a handful of beans, time. That last ingredient mattered most. Beans did not hurry. They needed soaking, simmering, patience. They needed someone to keep the fire alive, to add water when the pot grew low, to wait while the hard seeds slowly opened into food. In a hungry household, the stew might be thin. In better times, it might be thickened with corn, squash, herbs, or pieces of meat. But even when plain, beans carried a kind of quiet power. They helped fill the stomach. They gave strength for work. They could be stored through difficult months and brought back to life by water. Imagine the pot sitting near the coals as daylight fades. Outside, people return from fields, forests, or riverbanks. Their hands are scratched, their backs sore, their faces marked by wind. There may not be much to say, but there is a smell in the air now, earthy, warm, patient. A smell that tells them the day has not ended in emptiness. And around that pot, survival becomes communal. One person gathered fuel. One person stored the beans. One person watched the fire. One person served the portions. Food was rarely only food. It was cooperation made visible. It was the memory of planting, drying, saving, and sharing. A simple bean stew could carry a family through a cold evening. It could soften hunger enough for sleep. It could remind people that strength did not always come from the hunt or from sudden abundance. Sometimes it came from a seed small enough to hide in the palm. 11. Squash and pumpkin mash. Autumn had its own kind of mercy. Before the deepest cold, before the stored food had to be counted with care, fields and gardens could offer heavy fruits with thick skins and golden flesh. Squash and pumpkins in some farming regions were not just seasonal gifts. They were safeguards. Their flesh could be cooked until soft. Their seeds could be saved, roasted, or used again. Their outer shells could help them last longer than tender greens or fresh berries. In difficult times, a squash could become several meals if handled carefully. A mash of squash or pumpkin was simple, roasted, boiled, or softened near heat, then broken down into something warm and filling. It may have been eaten alone or mixed with cornmeal, beans, nuts, or whatever else was available. Picture a woman cutting into a stored squash after the first hard frosts. The air inside the shelter smells of smoke and earth. The fruit is not fresh from the vine anymore. Its skin is scarred. Its shape is uneven. But when opened, it still holds color, a deep orange glow, almost like sunlight kept inside food. That color mattered in winter, when the land outside looked gray and stripped, when leaves were gone and rivers ran cold. Food like this reminded people of harvest. It carried a memory of warmer days. It was soft enough for children, gentle enough for elders, thick enough to stretch hunger for a little while longer. There is something deeply human about mashing cooked squash beside a fire. The motion is slow, repeated, almost comforting. A hard thing becomes soft. A stored thing becomes living nourishment. A piece of autumn enters the body during winter. Poor food, some might call it. But to the people waiting for spring, it may have tasted like time won back from hunger. 10. Wild rice porridge. In the north, near lakes and slow waters, food could come not from a field of dry soil, but from the edge between water and sky. Wild rice, known and valued among certain indigenous communities of the Great Lakes and nearby regions, grew in shallow waters, where canoes could move quietly through tall stalks. Harvesting it required skill. It required timing. It required respect for the plant and the place. The grains were not simply taken. They were gathered with practiced motions, often in ways that allowed some to fall back into the water for the future. Imagine morning mist over a lake. A canoe glides forward. One person guides it with a pole. Another bends the rice stalks and gently knocks the grains loose. They fall like dark rain into the boat, soft at first, then gathering in small heaps. Around them, the water breathes. Birds call. The season is turning. Later, after drying and processing, wild rice could be stored, and when lean times came, it could be cooked with water into a porridge. Dark, nutty, fragrant, and sustaining. It was not fast food. It carried the labor of the wetlands. The careful drying, the parching, the cleaning, the long knowledge of when the rice was ready and when it was too soon. A bowl of wild rice porridge might not have needed much else. Water, heat, grain, patience. Yet in that bowl was an entire landscape. Lake mud, canoe wood, morning fog, human hands, and the memory of harvest songs and seasonal return. For people who knew those waters, survival was not separate from place. The marsh was not empty. The lake was not only a lake. It was a living storehouse, but only for those who understood how to enter it with care. And when hunger came, the dark grains in the pot could speak quietly of that relationship. They could say, "The water remembered us," and we remembered the water. 9. Ground seed cakes. Not all food announced itself. Some of it was tiny, hidden in dry grasses, waiting in seed heads, scattered across the land in forms easy to overlook. But ancient gatherers were not careless observers. They knew that small things could matter. Seeds from wild plants, grasses, and cultivated crops could be collected, dried, ground, and turned into meal. In some regions, this meal may have been shaped into cakes or mixed into other foods. These cakes were not the soft breads of abundance. They were often dense, plain, and practical. Imagine someone kneeling beside a grinding stone. The work is repetitive. Seeds go down. The stone moves. A faint powder gathers. The sound is rough and steady, stone against stone, body against time. This was not effortless food. A great deal of labor could produce only a small amount of meal. But when hunger was close, even a small cake mattered. It could be carried. It could be shared. It could be eaten with broth, dipped into stew, or softened with water. The genius of seed food was not only in its nutrition. It was in the ability to notice what others might miss. A field after flowering, a patch of plants near a camp, a dry stalk at the end of summer. To an untrained eye, these might seem like nothing. To someone raised with ancestral knowledge, they might be a future meal. And there is a lesson there. Survival often belongs to those who can read the small signs. Not only the deer tracks, not only the storm clouds, not only the obvious harvest, but the tiny seeds rattling in a dry husk, waiting to be gathered before the wind takes them. 8. Cattail root mash. In the marshes and wet places, where the ground softened underfoot and water held the sky in broken pieces, another kind of food waited below the surface. Cattails stood tall and familiar, their brown heads rising from shallow water like quiet markers. To someone without knowledge, they might have looked like weeds at the edge of a pond. But to people who understood wetlands, they could be useful in many ways. In some regions, parts of the cattail plant could provide material, pollen, shoots, and starchy roots or rhizomes that could be gathered and prepared as food. But this was not clean work. Imagine the cold grip of mud around the ankles, hands reaching down into dark water, fingers searching through tangled roots. The air smells of wet earth and old leaves. Every movement is slow because the marsh resists being opened. A person pulls, twists, and lifts a pale root from the mud. It does not look like much, but hunger changes what the eye sees. The root can be washed, scraped, pounded, roasted, boiled, or worked into a mash. In some cases, the starch could be separated and used like flour. It was not the food of ease. It was the food of effort. Food taken from a place where many people would not think to look. A cattail root mash would have been plain, earthy, and dense. It may not have carried the sweetness of squash or the comfort of corn gruel, but it offered something just as important: starch, weight, and warmth when stored foods were failing. There is a powerful image in that. Someone walking back from the marsh with mud on their arms and food in their hands. Not a great kill, not a basket full of bright harvest, just roots. Wet, heavy, difficult roots. And yet, for a hungry family, those roots could matter as much as anything brought back from the forest. Because survival was not always found in the beautiful places. Sometimes it was found in the cold mud beneath standing water, where knowledge had to reach deeper than the eye. 7. Sunflower seed meal. A seed is a small thing to trust with your life, but ancient people understood seeds differently than we often do now. They saw them not only as beginnings, but as stores of energy. A seed held the future of a plant, and because of that, it held oil, strength, and nourishment. Sunflowers were cultivated in parts of ancient North America long before European contact, and their seeds could be gathered, dried, cracked, and ground. The meal could be mixed into other foods, made into a paste, or used to enrich simpler dishes. In lean times, this mattered. Picture a flat stone warmed by the day's sun. Beside it, a small pile of dark seeds. A hand moved steadily, crushing them, breaking their shells, releasing their hidden richness. The smell is faint but warm, nutty, oily, alive. Sunflower seed meal was not bulky like squash, not watery like gruel, not dramatic like meat over a flame, but it was concentrated. A little could add strength to a thin meal. It could make a plain mush more sustaining. It could help the body endure cold, walking, labor, and long hours without abundance. In a hungry season, fat was precious. Energy was precious. Anything that gave more than simple fullness had value. And here again, the food tells us something about the people who used it. They did not only eat what was obvious. They worked with what was small, what needed preparation, what had to be saved from birds, dampness, insects, and time. A basket of seeds was a quiet treasure, not treasure that glittered, not treasure that marked power, but treasure that could be poured into a hand, ground into meal, and stirred into the evening pot when a child needed one more bowl. 6. Dried fish stew. Near rivers, lakes, and coasts, fish could be life itself. But fresh fish belongs to the moment. It must be eaten, shared, smoked, dried, or preserved before it spoils. Ancient communities who lived with seasonal fish runs and rich waters developed ways to make the gift last beyond the day it was caught. Drying and smoking could turn fish into stored food, lighter, tougher, and ready for times when fresh catch was uncertain. A dried fish stew may have begun with pieces that looked almost too hard to become food again. Thin strips, smoked edges, flesh darkened by air and fire. Perhaps not enough for a full meal on their own, but enough to flavor a pot. Water brought them back. The pieces softened slowly. Their smoke entered the broth. If there was corn, it could be added. If roots, greens, beans, or squash were available, they could join the pot. If there was almost nothing else, the fish itself still gave taste, salt from the body of the animal, and strength from the memory of a better catch. Imagine a cold evening near a river. The nets are empty now. The season of plenty has passed. But above the fire hangs a pot, and inside it, dried fish loosens into broth. The smell is strong, smoky, unmistakable. People gather closer, not because there is abundance, but because there is something. That difference matters. A stew like this was an act of refusing waste. The fish caught weeks or months before was still feeding people. The labor of cleaning, drying, hanging, guarding, and storing had not been lost. It returned in the steam. For many ancestral communities, preservation was not a side skill. It was survival itself. To dry food was to speak to the future. To smoke fish was to prepare for the night when the river gave nothing. And when that night came, the pot could still answer. After a hunt, nothing was simple. The taking of an animal meant labor, danger, gratitude, skill, and responsibility. Meat could feed people. Hides could warm them. Sinew could bind tools. Bones could become implements, and fat could become precious energy. In many ancestral communities, wasting what had been given was not only careless, it could be dangerous. When hunger lived close, even bones still had a voice. A bone broth might begin after the best pieces of meat were already gone. What remained could look poor to an impatient eye. Cracked bones, joints, scraps of flesh, bits of marrow, cartilage, skin, perhaps a small amount of fat clinging where a knife had not reached. But fire and water could find what teeth and hands had missed. The bones went into a pot or heated vessel. Water covered them. The fire stayed low. Slowly, the hard remains released flavor, grease, minerals, and warmth. The broth might be thin, but thin did not mean useless. It could be sipped by elders. It could soften cornmeal. It could stretch scraps into a meal for several people. It could bring comfort when the body was cold and weak. Picture the scene late at night. Outside, the wind moves against the shelter. Inside, the firelight trembles across faces. The meal has already been divided, but one more pot remains near the coals. It is not beautiful. It is not rich. Yet the smell rising from it carries the memory of the animal, the hunt, the work of cutting and scraping, the decision to save even what seemed finished. Someone lifts a small bowl. The broth is warm in their hands. There is a kind of tenderness in that moment, not softness exactly, because life could be hard, but tenderness in the care taken to make one more use, one more portion, one more warmth from what was left. Bone broth reminds us that survival often depended on completeness. The whole animal mattered. The whole plant mattered. The whole season mattered. People watched carefully because carelessness could become hunger later. And in a hungry time, a cracked bone was not empty. It was a final gift waiting for patience. 4. Preserved dried meat with fat. In cold lands, open plains, forests, and long travel routes, one of the great challenges was not only finding food, it was carrying strength forward. Fresh meat could save people for a day or a week. Preserved meat could save them later, when weather turned, when game moved away, when bodies needed energy and there was no time for a full meal. In some regions of North America, indigenous communities prepared dense, preserved foods from dried meat, fat, and sometimes berries or other ingredients. The exact methods varied, and they should not be treated as one single practice shared by all people. But the idea behind such foods was powerful. Make nourishment portable, concentrated, and lasting. Imagine strips of meat drying in smoke and wind. They grow dark, tough, light enough to carry. Then comes the work of pounding, steady blows, turning dried meat into fibers and flakes. Fat, rendered and saved with care, is mixed in. Berries may be added in some traditions, bringing tartness, sweetness, and another layer of nourishment. To modernize, this might seem like trail food, but to people facing real uncertainty, it was much more than convenience. It was stored endurance. A small piece could carry a person through hours of walking. It could feed hunters away from home. It could support families during hard weather. It could become part of trade, travel, and winter preparation. It did not need to look plentiful to be powerful. Its strength was hidden in density. The emotional weight of this food is heavy because it speaks of planning beyond the present moment. Someone had to think ahead while there was still meat to save. Someone had to protect the fat from spoilage. Someone had to prepare for the day when fresh food would not come. And that is one of the quiet truths of survival. The future is fed by the discipline of the present. In a time of hunger, preserved meat and fat could feel almost sacred, not because it was ceremonial in every context, but because it held life in a compact form. It was the memory of an animal, the labor of many hands, the heat of old fires, and the hope that the road ahead could still be crossed. 3. Thin soup from scraps. There is a kind of meal that rarely gets remembered by name. It may not have belonged to one people, one place, or one recipe. It was not always written into memory as a special dish, but in hungry homes across the world, including ancient North America, it may have been one of the most important kinds of food ever made. A thin soup from scraps. The idea was simple. Take what remains and let water carry it farther. A few kernels of corn, a broken piece of dried fish, a handful of greens, a cracked bone already boiled once before, a strip of squash, wild onion, roots, seeds, fat, ash-cooked crumbs, anything safe and known, anything that could give flavor or strength. Alone, each piece might seem too small to matter. Together, in a pot, they became something that could be shared. This was not a recipe of abundance. It was a strategy of mercy. Imagine a cook looking into storage and seeing almost nothing. Not nothing exactly, but not enough. That is the hardest kind of hunger. The hunger of counting. The hunger of deciding. The hunger of knowing that every portion given now may leave less for tomorrow. So the pot is filled with water. The scraps go in. The fire works slowly. The soup becomes thin but warm. It may not fully satisfy the stomach, but it pushes back against emptiness. It gives children something to swallow before sleep. It gives the old something gentle. It gives the tired a reason to sit together instead of facing hunger alone. There is deep intelligence in this kind of food. It requires knowing what can be mixed, what must be avoided, what flavors can hide bitterness, what ingredients need longer cooking, what should be added only at the end. It also requires a social wisdom that is harder to measure. How to divide little without breaking trust. A thin soup from scraps tells us that poor food is not failed food. It is often food made under pressure, food shaped by love, fear, skill, and necessity. Food that says, there is not enough, but we will make it reach as far as we can. And maybe that is why such meals deserve remembrance, not because they were grand, but because they were honest, because they held families together on nights when the land had not yet given more. 2. Ash-cooked bread or cakes. Long before iron ovens, long before modern kitchens, bread could be made in the oldest oven of all, the fire itself. A small amount of meal, corn, acorn, seeds, or another safe ground food known in a particular region, could be mixed with water into a rough dough. Sometimes it may have been shaped by hand, flattened into a cake, and placed on a hot stone. Sometimes it could be tucked near the coals, or cooked in clean ash, where heat surrounded it slowly. There was no luxury in this, no polished table, no soft cloth, no deep pantry waiting nearby. Only flour, water, fingers, fire, and the judgment of someone who knew when the heat was right. Picture hands pressing dough into a flat round. The surface cracks a little. It is not perfect, and it does not need to be. The cook brushes aside the hottest coals, finds the place where the ash is pale and steady, and lays the cake down. Smoke moves low across the ground. Sparks lift and vanish into the dark. For a while, nothing happens. Then the smell comes. Warm grain, smoke, earth, the scent of food becoming solid enough to carry, tear, dip, or share. Ash-cooked cakes were useful because they did not ask for much. They could be made in a settled home, a temporary camp, beside a trail, or near a hunting place. They did not require a large vessel. They could turn stored meal into something that felt more like a meal than loose grain or thin gruel. They could travel in a pouch, be softened in broth, or eaten slowly during work. In hungry times, that mattered. A person could take a small cake and make it last. A child could hold it in both hands. An elder could break it into warm liquid. A traveler could carry it away from the fire and still keep a piece of home close to the body. There is something ancient and intimate about bread cooked this way. The fire marks it. The ash leaves its memory. The outside may be darkened, rough, even bitter at the edge, but inside, if the heat was right, it holds softness. And maybe that is why such food feels so human. It begins with almost nothing. It passes through fire. It comes out changed, just like the people who depended on it. 1. The Three Sisters Stew. At the end of this list, we return to the pot. Not because every ancient North American community ate the same food, and not because one dish can speak for an entire continent. North America was and is a vast land of many peoples, climates, languages, traditions, and foodways. What sustained one community in the desert might not sustain another beside a northern lake. What belonged to one valley might be unknown in another forest. But in many farming societies, especially in parts of what is now eastern North America and other regions where these crops were grown together, corn, beans, and squash held a special place. They are often remembered as the three sisters. In the field, they could support one another. Corn rising tall, beans climbing, squash spreading broad leaves over the soil, helping shade the ground and protect moisture. This was not only agriculture, it was relationship made visible. And in the pot, that relationship became food. A three sisters stew could be simple: corn, beans, squash, water, heat, and time. In some places, other ingredients might be added: herbs, meat, fish, nuts, chili, or wild greens, depending on the region and the season. But even in its humblest form, the combination mattered. Corn gave fullness, beans gave lasting strength, squash gave softness, sweetness, and body. Together, they made something more complete than any one of them alone. Imagine the stew cooking slowly as evening settles. The corn softens first, releasing its familiar warmth into the water. The beans deepen the broth. The squash breaks down, turning the liquid thick and golden. The fire pops. Shadows move across the shelter walls. Outside, the land grows dark, but inside the pot, summer and autumn return together. This was survival, but it was also teaching. A child watching that stew might learn more than how to eat. They might learn that foods can belong together. That strength can come from balance. That planting is an act of faith. That the harvest is never only the work of one hand. That a meal can carry the structure of a whole way of life. In a hard season, three sisters' stew could be stretched thin. In better times, it could be rich and filling. But even when humble, it carried memory. Fields tended under sun, seeds saved carefully, harvests stored against cold, and generations of cooks who knew how to turn crops into endurance. And so the final dish is not final because it is the richest. It is final because it reminds us of the heart of all the others. Survival was not just about finding food. It was about knowing food. Knowing when to gather and when to wait. Knowing how to remove bitterness, how to dry for winter, how to save seeds, how to use bones, how to stretch scraps, how to feed the weakest first, how to make one bowl serve many. The fire is lower now. The pot is nearly empty. Someone scrapes the last thick spoonful from the bottom and gives it to a child. Outside, the wind still moves through the dark. The hunger of the season has not vanished. Tomorrow will bring its own work, its own uncertainty, its own search for fuel, water, roots, grain, fish, meat, or anything the land may offer. But tonight there was food. Not much, not luxurious, not the kind of meal that would be carved into monuments or praised in songs of power. Just a bowl of something warm, a cake from the ash, a broth from bones, a mush made from bitter nuts, a handful of corn saved for the road, a stew built from seeds, patience, and memory. These humble dishes remind us that ancient life was not only made of great migrations, battles, cities, monuments, or ceremonies. It was also made of quieter victories. A pot that did not burn. A child who slept with food in their stomach. An elder who remembered the right plant. A family that made it through one more night. To call these foods poor is only partly true. They were poor in luxury, perhaps, poor in ornament, poor in ease, but they were rich in knowledge, rich in labor, rich in the deep attention that comes from living close to the land and understanding that every seed, root, bone, fish, nut, and flame might one day matter. And if we listen closely, these old foods still speak. They speak from the smoke of ancient fires, from grinding stones worn smooth by hands long gone, from lake waters where wild rice once fell into canoes, from fields where corn, beans, and squash grew together, from the quiet places where people did not conquer hunger forever, but met it with skill, patience, and care. They remind us that survival is not always loud. Sometimes it is a bowl passed gently in the dark.